Hello everyone, my name is Cassandra Janicki. Welcome to Business Law at Columbia College. Today we're going to be talking about the last element of a valid and enforceable contract. We'll be learning today about what form your contract has to take in order for it to be enforceable. We'll also be talking about specialty areas dealing with particularized forms, be it written, be it oral. So those are the things we'll be talking about today. Now, you've seen this screen before, but one last time. We know that in order for a contract to be valid and enforceable, there must be an agreement between two or more competent parties based on those parties' genuine assent. The contract must be supported by consideration, and it has to be made for a lawful purpose. Today, we're going to be talking about whether or not your contract has to be written in order to be enforceable. One general rule that we have talked about is that not all contracts have to be in writing in order to be enforceable, and in fact, an oral agreement can very well be just as enforceable as a written agreement. But what we know is that a written agreement is certainly stronger evidence of what the parties did in fact agree to. And so is it a best practice to put all contracts in writing? The answer to that question is yes, regardless of the type of contract that you have. But not all contracts have to be in writing in order to be enforceable, and that's the issue we're going to be exploring today. So, the first question that we're answering in this section is, does a contract have to be written in order to be enforceable? Or can the type of contract that you've entered into be enforceable as an oral agreement? It's question number one. If the answer is that it must be written, what writing will be sufficient in order to prove a valid and enforceable contract? What components must be there in order for it to be sufficient? That's the second rule question that we'll be answering today. Now, we in the law have this common understanding, and it is a common law, of the statute of frauds. Now, are oral contracts typically enforceable? Yeah, that is absolutely true. However, historically, and now in ways that states have put into statute this particular common law, the statute of frauds recognizes that there are certain types of contracts that we know are more inclined to have fraudulent activity in them. And so there are certain categories of contracts that must be evidenced by a writing in order to be enforceable. The purpose here is to avoid exactly that, fraud. We want to make sure that people are entering into these particular types of contracts in ways that are appropriate, legally sound, and in order for them to be valid and enforceable, you gotta have them in writing. Now, those areas or types of contracts are going to be based on the substantive content of the contract. So what is the purpose of the contract? I present to you my legs, not my actual physical legs, but the acronym my legs. So contracts that have to be evidenced by a writing in order to be valid and enforceable are contracts dealing with marriage, contracts that last longer than a year, contracts dealing with the sale of land, buildings, anything really associated with a land deal, contracts dealing with executorships, contracts for the sales of goods, and contracts for suretyships. So we're going to go through each one of these in turn. The M, marriage. So promises to pay a sum of money or to give property to another in consideration of marriage, those are contractual relationships that must be evidenced by a writing in order to be enforceable. So dowries, arranged marriages, things of that nature have to be evidenced by a writing. Prenuptial and antenuptial agreements must be in writing because they deal with the marriage contractual relationship. Prenuptial agreements cannot be set aside where there has been full disclosure unless the agreement is unconscionable. Now here, we have talked about what unconscionability means, and is something that shocks the conscience, that is so blatantly uneven and unfair that a court will look at it and say, oh, As a public policy matter, we can't enforce this contract. Very rare, must be very careful. In the state of California, there are significant protections and requirements surrounding prenuptial agreements. I recommend that everybody have a prenuptial agreement. Doesn't matter if you have no money, tons of money, lots of debt, no debt, everybody should have a prenuptial agreement. But that's my lawyer hat. Now, contracts that by their term or by the subject matter cannot be performed within 1 year of the date of agreement must be evidenced in a writing. And this one we really recognize as being within the statute of frauds and ripe for fraudulent activity and fraudulent opportunities, because over a year, people's minds change, right? Their memory can change. You can stop remembering things, or you can miraculously remember new things. So this is the type of contract that we want to be evidenced by a writing, because let's say you go back 5 years later to a contract and you say, hey, somebody didn't perform, and then they say, hey, I did perform under our contract. That's what I thought I had to do, but you don't have it in writing. Who's to say who was right? So that's why it needs to be in the writing. Now, the time for the 1 year to elapse begins at the agreement, not at performance, okay? There is no partial performance exception, so just because you perform part of it within a year doesn't mean that that negates the need for the contract to be in writing. In certain contractual relationships, it will be obvious by the face of the contract that it can't be done within a year, right? Completion of a, really large building complex probably can't be done within a year. Not something that you want to do in terms of a written contract. It would also fall under land, and so you don't want to do that either under my legs, right? But if performance could conceivably occur within a year, then an oral contract is okay. But is that a risk you want to run? I would hazard a guess the answer is no. But if it could conceivably occur within a year, performance could be completed within a year, then you can do an oral contract and that could be enforceable. If it is a contract that can terminate at will, then the statute of frauds does not apply because it could conceivably terminate within a year. Therefore, oral contracts are okay. So if you work at an at-will job with no contract, no written contract, that could end within a year, doesn't have to be in writing. Contracts to sell land, buildings, or any interest in land have to be in writing. Any leases that are over 1 year must be in writing. This is one of the areas where, under my legs, partial performance has an exception. So typically, under my legs, under the statute of frauds, partial performance in general is an unacceptable excuse. Just because you perform partially doesn't mean that the fact that you didn't have it in writing will not make it enforceable, right? So here, however, under land, we recognize that there are some ways that a party can perform that will show us that they are not being fraudulent or not lying about the existence of an oral contract. So let's say, for example, my grandfather owns a really dilapidated house out on a piece of property. And him and I orally agree that I will live on the land, I will improve the house, and by the time I'm done improving the house, he will give me the house. Okay? I move onto the property, I start to make improvements on the house, and then all of a sudden my grandfather comes to me and he's like, hey, you have to get off, you gotta leave, I'm not giving you the house, and you gotta leave everything that you've done here with me. We have an oral contract, nothing is in writing. I go to a court and I say, hey judge, listen, this was our agreement, I moved onto that property, I started doing XYZ, here's all my proof that I did that. I partially performed on an oral contract, and you should force my grandfather to perform on his end of the contract, okay? In land deals, partial performance is an exception to the requirement that the contract must be in writing in order to be enforceable. That means that that oral contract that I made with my grandfather, in addition to evidence of my partial performance, can lead to a court finding that there is a valid and enforceable contract in place. So, if I take possession of the land, I make substantial improvements to the land, and those improvements cannot be easily ascertained, the court may enforce my oral contract. Or, if I take possession of the land and I make a partial payment on the land, the court may find that my oral agreement to purchase that land in that way is enforceable. Now, first exception, right? Typically, land, buildings, improvements to land, improvements to buildings, those are things that are pretty easily ascertainable in terms of a monetary value, right? You can figure that out. There are people who do that daily, right? Assessors and people like that. So that one's a little bit harder. But if you move on to the land and you start paying for stuff on the land and an oral contract's in place, there is a very strong likelihood that the court will enforce that contract, even though it's not in writing. Now, some of you may not know what an executorship is, so I'll explain that briefly. An executor is a person who is either appointed by the court or chosen by a person who died, okay, so chosen through their will, and given the duty of handling all of the dead person's affairs and estates, including paying off any debts that the decedent owed, and then distributing whatever remained after those debts are paid. Now, that is oftentimes an utterly thankless job. Nobody typically likes the executor. It really sucks. And the executor has no duty to pay for anything out of their own pocket, right? It's a thankless job, and it's also a job that doesn't pay you, and it's also a job that doesn't require you to pay anything but your time. So, we recognize that if someone comes in and says, hey, the executor promised to pay this debt or this cost associated with the decedent out of their own pocket, that type of argument, that type of agreement is not something someone typically will enter into. So if that's the agreement, that agreement needs to be in writing in order for a court to believe that a contract existed in the first place. Because the executor has no obligation legally, has no real moral obligation to enter into those contracts and agree to pay for them themselves, not out of the estate's money. So, if an executor makes a promise to pay a debt that's owed or a cost out of their own pocket, that contract must be in writing in order for it to be enforceable. However, if an executor agrees to pay for funeral costs out of the decedent's bank account, the decedent's money, right? That's totally fine, doesn't require a writing. That's what an executor is duty-bound to do, pay for the debts of the estate, and that doesn't have to be in writing. The difference is really where that money is coming from. And why would an executor ever agree to pay for something out of their own pocket if there was decedent's money available to pay for that? Very unlikely, therefore ripe for fraud, therefore must be in writing. Goods. So contracts for the sale of goods that are valued over $500 must be in writing. So your receipt when you buy a very expensive TV for $499 at Walmart doesn't have to be in writing. $500 or more has to be in writing. Surety ships. So this is another one of those ships that not everybody may be familiar with. So we just talked about executorships, and that's when somebody has to deal with a dead person's stuff. A surety ship is where you agree to answer for the debt of another person. The main purpose here is to spread the debt around, right? So for example, when I entered into college, I needed a cosigner on my private student loans because I wasn't a good bet for a loan company because I had no credit, I had no history, right? I was 18, they didn't want to loan to me, but they were more than willing to loan to my grandfather, who as a cosigner agreed to answer for my debt if I ever failed to pay it. He was my surety, he was my cosigner. You may also see, for example, requirements in leases where a kid who's, 18, 19, 20, has no credit history, whatever, has to have another person co-sign on that lease and agree to make rent payments if the person living there doesn't do so, okay? Who does that? Who does that willingly, right? Those are areas, once again, that are ripe for fraud because another individual has no gain in that, right? You're literally benefiting another person to your own detriment with potentially no benefit to you. So because of that, that is a contract that in order to be enforceable, it must be in writing. But because the law lives for its exceptions, there is one exception to the suretyship rule. If the main purpose of the cosigner or suretor's promise to pay is for their own benefit, then it will be enforceable even if it isn't in writing. Now, what example does that serve? Well, it could be something like, hey, we have two people that are cosigners on a car loan. Maybe those folks are getting a divorce. One person moves out, leaves the car, doesn't make payments. That other suretor, that cosigner, may very well make those payments and agree to make those payments so that that person can keep the car. Okay? Now, let me move my box a little bit so that you can perhaps not see. I'll move it again. So how does the statute of frauds come into play? Again, any one of these elements can be missing from your contract, and if the parties just perform the contract's been performed, right? There's no issue. It's only once somebody raises the issue that we have to address these elements. So, for example, so take that example with me and my grandfather, right? With the land that I moved on to and started repairing. We have an oral agreement and he tries to renege on his portion of the agreement, namely giving me the land, right? So now he's trying to boot me off. So I go to a court and I say, hey judge, listen, here's what happened. Here's our oral agreement. Here's my partial performance. He's trying to boot me off of the property. I need you to say that this is a valid and enforceable contract. My grandfather on the other side will say, hey judge, listen, this is a contract dealing with land. We never had an agreement in writing. It's a violation of the statute of frauds. You should find that this is not an enforceable agreement and you should find that I do not have to perform. Make sense? Here's the deal. That may very well be a finding that the court makes, that, hey, too bad, it's not in writing, you're out of luck. It's not an enforceable contract. But if you can show that an injustice would happen if they didn't enforce some kind of agreement, you can utilize the concept of promissory estoppel. Promissory estoppel will allow the court to enforce the contract or give damages to the party that's harmed if they can show that the promise lacked consideration or wasn't written, that the promisor intended or should have reasonably expected that the promisee would rely on the promise. So my grandfather should have expected that I would rely on his promise. I did, in fact, rely on that promise because I moved onto the property. I started making improvements. That was a definite and substantial way that I relied on it. And it would not be fair for you to just kick me off the property, give me nothing back for the things that I've done with the land, money or otherwise, or allow me to stay on the property. So, you're not completely foreclosed from getting something back if your contract fails as a result of it not being written. But you really just want to avoid that at all costs and have everything be in writing. So, if you can show this reasonable reliance, if you can show this enhanced level of unjust enrichment or unconscionable injury, then you can utilize promissory estoppel to get something out of a deal that you did orally that should have been in writing. Okay, so you have a contract that has to be in writing in order to be enforceable under the statute of frauds. What makes a writing, right? What is required in order for the writing to be sufficient? Well, it has to be signed by the party who intends to be bound by the contract. So, me and my grandfather, right? The content has to contain all of the essential terms of the contract in order to satisfy the statute of frauds. If any one term that is essential to the understanding of the contract is missing, it's not going to be a sufficient writing, and you might as well have made an oral contract. So, you can incorporate by reference documents outside of the contract itself. So, like a price list, another contract if that's applicable, but they have to be clearly expressed by reference or be attached to the contract or clearly deal with the same subject matter, right? So you either have to expressly reference it, staple that shit to the contract, or have it be so plainly related and based on the same subject matter that a court would incorporate it by reference. So what happens? What happens if you don't comply with the statute of frauds? What happens if you don't have a written contract when you should? Basically, most states say, hey, sorry about it. You're shit out of luck. Should have been in writing and it's not. That's an unenforceable contract. We, again, can avoid that by A, putting it in writing, or B, arguing unjust enrichment and promissory estoppel. The only person that can raise an issue with the statute of frauds as a defense to enforcement of a contract is a party to the contract. So if I'm a third party, which we'll talk about in our next lecture, if I'm a third party to the contract and I'm supposed to benefit, but the contract wasn't in writing, I don't get to raise the fact that it wasn't in writing as a defense to performance. Okay. So you have a written contract and the parties are starting to perform, but some of the parties aren't happy with performance. So they sue the other party. Now we're before a court and we have a contract and we're talking about whether or not performance was adequate, whether or not it fit the terms of the contract. Here's the issue. If you have a written contract, there is a very strong possibility that the written contract is the only thing that the court will consider in interpreting the contract's contents and application to the facts. What do I mean by that? Well, testimony of witnesses, not going to be admissible to change, explain, or help the court understand the terms of your contract. And that is because of the parole evidence rule. So the word parole means something that is given or expressed orally. So parole evidence is oral evidence that comes from outside of the contractual document itself. And the parole evidence rule basically says, hey, listen, anything outside the four corners of the contract is excluded for the purposes of interpreting that contract. If you had wanted to explain it better, you should have explained it in the contract. If something was missing from the contract, you should have put it in the contract before you sign it, and you're SOL if you didn't. And the court won't consider that evidence, the evidence outside of the contract, in order to add, modify, or to contradict the terms of a written contract. So, parole evidence is really a continuation of this understanding that we have about the possibility of fraud in contractual relationships. If you had wanted it in the written contract, you should have put it in the written contract. And contracts that are fully integrated or that appear complete on their face will not be altered, added, or changed by virtue of outside evidence, because if you had wanted it in there, you should have put it in there. So evidence of any earlier or contemporaneous oral or written agreements that were not included in the written contract that looks complete on its face are inadmissible. You don't get to talk about them. The court doesn't get to consider them. And so this is one of the reasons why contracts are so long and ungodly to read, because you better put it all in there, right? Because the outside stuff doesn't get to come in unless. And the parole evidence rule does not apply if you are presenting outside or extrinsic evidence, so stuff outside the four corners of the contract, to explain something that is ambiguous. And that makes sense, because if something is ambiguous, it's because there's more than one reasonable explanation for that thing that's in the contract that's ambiguous. So be it a term or literally a word, right? Like a word can be ambiguous. Like, what does that word mean in that context? I don't know, because you could interpret it in one of three different ways. So a court might allow the parties to come in and say and testify, hey, judge, I thought it meant this. And then the other party's going to come in and say, hey, I thought it meant this. And then the court has to break the tie about what that word actually meant. Okay, so you can admit outside or extrinsic evidence to explain something that's ambiguous, because obviously if there was a definition in the contract, it wouldn't be ambiguous, right? Okay, you can also utilize outside or extrinsic evidence to show that there was fraud, duress, or a mistake in the formation of the contract. Why do those make sense? Well, I can tell you right now, someone's not going to put in a contract that they're defrauding somebody. Okay, not that obvious, hopefully, typically. Maybe you put in a footnote, but generally, you're not going to say in the contract that it was fraud. You're also not going to say, hey, I'm holding a gun to this guy's head and that's the only reason why he's signing the contract. So you're not going to put evidence of duress in the four corners of the contract. And if a mistake was made, you didn't realize it was a mistake at the time of the formation of the contract. So you'd have to admit outside evidence to explain that mistake. Okay? Moreover, the last exception to the parole evidence rule is that if you want to show that the contract itself was modified through oral agreement, that necessarily would never have been in the four corners of the contract because it was modified after you entered into the contract. So absent you writing an addendum and attaching it to the contract, right, which you should do to avoid this issue, or writing it in the margin and signing and dating it. Also avoid doing that, just type an addendum, okay? That stuff's not going to be there. That's not going to be in the original contract, and it never would have been. And so that's why there are these exceptions to the general rule that you don't get outside information to interpret a contract, a written contract. Now, there are a variety of rules that a court will abide by, look at, utilize when interpreting contracts. So I'm just going to talk about each one of them briefly. Always and forever, a court will look at a contract and say, what was the intention of the parties in entering into this agreement? You will find very often in contracts that there is an intention paragraph somewhere near the top explaining why the parties are entering into a contract and what their goals are in that contract. If you don't have one in there, then the court will have to presume through context, right, contextual reading of your contract, what your intent was and how and why you wanted to be bound into the contract. Words are very typically given their ordinary meaning in a contract. So, you know, a word will mean what the word means in the dictionary, absent there being some specific trade definition of that word, or absent there being a definition of that word within the contract itself. Okay. Contracts, as I mentioned, can incorporate missing terms by reference to another document. Again, if they're expressly referenced, if they are stapled to the contract, and things of that nature. You can include missing terms by reference. Courts will also look at the whole contract and say, okay, how is this contract supposed to be performed? How do we give effect to every single part in the contract? They want to enforce your whole contract. They don't want to piecemeal stuff out. And by interpreting the whole contract, the document as a whole, what they will strive to do is avoid internal inconsistencies within your contract. So if A equaled B at the top of your contract, they're not going to later say A equals C, because those are two things that would be inconsistent with one another, particularly if B doesn't equal C. Do you follow? Now, you've seen me going like this, right? 4 corners of a contract right here, okay? That's a contractual construction and interpretation rule. The court will look at the 4 corners of the contract to ensure that it all flows right and isn't contradictory or ambiguous within itself. So, as we noted when we talked about the parole evidence rule, if there's something that's ambiguous within your contract, the court's going to look for outside evidence, because how else do they break the tie on the ambiguity? If there is ambiguity, they'll look to background of the parties, if they've had any prior contracts, what those look like. They're also going to look to see whether or not it was a pre-printed form or a form that had options, maybe things were circled incorrectly, things like that. And they're always going to look at words over numbers. And they're going to do that because it takes you some time to type out the words, but sometimes you can get numbers wrong. And so that's why you'll oftentimes see in contracts, it'll say, it'll be $80 a month, and the $80 will be written out, and then in parentheses, it'll put 80 as the number, right? And that's to show and to eliminate any ambiguity. If you are the party who is drafting the contract, be very careful that you do it right, because there will be a strict rule where ambiguities within the written contract will be construed against the person that wrote the contract. Because as the person writing the contract, you should have realized it was ambiguous and you should have fixed it before everybody signed it. Courts will kind of as a last resort, these two are kind of our last resort rules of construction and interpretation. Because again, courts do not want to be in a position of having to figure out what you meant. That's the whole reason of having a written contract. So they will, if they have to, look at the prior conduct of the parties and their conduct while performing this current contract as the best guide for what their intent was when they entered it. If it's a trade-specific contract, they may utilize the customs and usages of the trade to interpret how a contract should be read and performed and enforced. However, they're never going to use custom or trade to override an express provision, because if you had wanted trade to govern it, it would have been written as such. So if you wrote it a different way, then obviously you wanted it enforced in a different way. Okay? And then avoidance of hardship. Now recall, rule number 1, people get to enter into stupid contracts every day. And that includes entering into really bad contracts, contracts that put them in a really bad spot. You get to enter into bad contracts. However, if you're in a position where you're having to have a court interpret what a contract meant, how it affected both parties, they don't want to put people into a position of hardship. And so by avoiding hardship, what the courts do is they hearken back to that old concept of equity. And last resort, they're going to try to avoid hardship, but sometimes they just have to enforce a bad deal, right? Okay, so that is the end of our discussion of this last element of a valid and enforceable contract. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next time.